Good afternoon, everyone. The module for this afternoon would be empowering architects to do designs for the future. And to start off our discussions for today, for this afternoon, may call on Dean Teresa Gomez of Bulacan State University to be our moderator for this afternoon. A round of applause, please.
Thank you very much, Carla. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the fourth module for this convention. May I invite Architect Peter Mould to sit up front. Okay, so we'll be having two seminars for today, for this afternoon. So after the first talk, we'll have a break. And after that, we'll have the second speaker. And the question and answer will come after the two seminars. Okay, so I'll be introducing now the first speaker for the afternoon. Our first speaker has over 40 years experience in Australia and overseas in both the private and government sector. He is a life fellow of the Australian Institute of Architects, former vice president of the new NSW chapter, and was visiting professor at the Faculty of the Built Environment University in New South Wales 2009 to 2012. Our speaker is currently a member of the City of Sydney Design Advisory Panel, the Victorian Design Review Panel, and the South Australian Capital City Design Review Panel, the Sydney Olympic Park Design Review Panel, the Sydney Opera House Eminent Architects Panel, the Sydney Opera House Conservation Council, the Walsh Bay Arts Present Committee, and is chair of the Built Environment Advisory Committee, UNSW. He regularly sits on the design juries for competitions and projects in Australia and New Zealand. His projects have received numerous awards for architecture, urban design, and adaptive reuse. His experience is in the design, documentation, and construction of major public, architectural, and urban design projects. He writes and lectures on architecture with a particular interest in Islamic architecture. From a very macro aspect of this morning's seminar, which is the urbanism, he'll be having a more micro presentation, which is about the role of public space. So, without further ado, may I now call our first speaker for this afternoon, Architect Peter Mould.
Firstly, thank you. Is that working? Thank you, Teresa, and thank you to UAP for inviting me here. I can't believe the hospitality and the friendship I've enjoyed since I've been here, and I can't say how impressed I am at the size of your convention in Australia. If we got 1,000 people to a Congress, we'd be very, very happy. To get 2,300 is just extraordinary. A little bit about my talk. It's called Future-Proofing the Cities, but that's probably not a very accurate title because some of the things I'm going to look at are from the past as well as from the future. That was just to fit in with the Designing for the Future stream that I'm talking in. But really the role of public space is what I want to talk about, but particularly the role of designers in public space and how we as designers can have an input into that. And to do that, I'll illustrate with some examples. Firstly, I'll give a little bit of background because we've probably all got a different understanding of what design is and what urban design is and where we're coming from. And then I'll illustrate a range of design ideas through those topics that I've got listed there. Each of those topics refers to a project, and that project will, I hope, illustrate the points I'm talking about and hopefully reveal some of the thinking behind the projects that we've worked on in my office. We've been thinking about the future for as long as we can think back in the past, and popular culture has been a very evocative way of looking at the future. Way back in 1927, in his famous movie Metropolis, Fritz Lang, the German director, had a vision of the future city. And we haven't quite reached that vision, but there are things. There's highways up in the air, there's planes flying between buildings in this instance, but certainly in cities. But it was a way of imagining what the future might be. Back in the 60s, there was a famous cartoon show that came out of America called The Jetsons, where people lived up in apartments up in the air and flew to their shops and so forth. Movies like Blade Runner, and you can all think of hundreds of examples, imagined a different version of the future, but they all nearly involved some input into the city and what the city was. So to talk about urban design, as I said, we could read lots of books and lots of people will define it differently. For the purpose of today's talk, the definition I'd like to use is the one I've got here, which is that I see urban design as the art of place making, of making places, of city building and of creating and improving the public realm. It's concerned with both the organisation and structure of the urban fabric and with its detailed design. And by that I mean both the whole conceptual layout, but also down to the nitty-gritty of what the paving might be and how the lighting works. Some projects set the agenda for the future, and others help to repair mistakes of the past. Some work at a grand scale and some work at a far more intimate scale, and I hope the different projects I show you will illustrate examples of all those. In terms of thinking about design in urban planning, we've been planning our cities. I mean, the Romans planned their cities. We've been planning cities for thousands of years, but it was, I think, Camillo Sitte in 1889 who first started talking about city planning according to artistic principles. That is, how do we think about it as the design of places rather than just the layout of places, which is, I guess, with the beginning of thinking of urban design. And Corbusier, all our great thinkers have thought about this thing. He said modern life demands and is waiting for a new kind of plan, both for the house and the city. And as we know, he came up with the design for the city, his famous Ville Radius in 1935. And you can see the vision that he had for the future of the city. He had this vision for Paris, which is a very different Paris than the one we all know. And we're not sure that this was a particularly good vision, but it was certainly a vision for the future. It would probably be manifested in its purest form in Brasilia in 1957, when Lucio Costa headed the team that did the layout of Brasilia and used those principles that Corbusier had set out. Other thinkers, the famous Austrian but who became American architect Richard Neutra, who became famous for his houses in California, also thought about the city and had this vision back in 1923 of a future city. And post-Second World War in Europe, after the devastation, a lot of things like that vision were built, and not all of them were successful socially, and a lot of them have been either demolished or repaired, but it was certainly a way of quickly, and they thought at the time, efficiently housing people. Another view of thinking was a more romantic view, and this is the layout of Canberra by the American architect Walter Burley Griffin, who came to Australia and who won the competition for designing the city. And he trained in Frank Lloyd Wright's office. And his thinking there wasn't about that rationalist planning, but it was more about how you respond to nature. The vistas he picked up on for the layout of his highways were based on views up to the mountains that surrounded the town. The valley he decided to flood and create a lake in the centre. So he's using the natural elements as a way of informing the shape and the future of the city. In the 1960s, those of you who are old enough to remember this, remember there was a team called Archigram, worked out of the United Kingdom, who came up with crazy ideas like the walking city and the blow-up city and the plug-in city, quick ways that they thought of solving disasters. None of these ever came to fruition, but they were just a way of stimulating thinking. Kenzo Tange thought about building in Tokyo Bay with a megastructure back in 1960. Norman Foster and Foster and Partners also thought of building in Tokyo Bay in 1991. So some ideas just don't go away, do they? I guess when the city gets congested, you start building out into the water. And Paul Rudolph was doing the same thing in the 60s and 70s, thinking about Lower Manhattan and again building out into the water and building over highways. You can see in the illustration on the right how the cars are below, so burying the highways and allowing the infrastructure of the housing to be above it rather than the other way around. Of course, there's a new vision of the world now with global warming and climate change. We're rethinking our cities, so Paul Rudolph's idea of building into the bay would have to be rethought in this sort of fairly dramatic scenario. And so as a consequence, new thoughts are coming out about what future dwellings might be like. And so the idea of maybe living in the sea because the sea is rising might be new versions. And here's a couple, one by Arabs in 2010, or both in 2010, and the other, the water scraper. These are both ideas of floating a city in the thing and drawing energy from the sea. Masdar is another environmental city that is being planned in Qatar, I think, and the whole idea of this city is supposed to be a very environmentally friendly city. The thing I find most attractive about this is nothing in it is taller than 5 stories. So instead of the vertical city, we're going for the dense city, but dense at a low scale. And so there's 2 ways of thinking about all these things. One way, I guess, is learning from the past. We look at the cities that we like or the cities that we seem to work. A lot of the European towns and cities, of course, they've grown up over thousands of years and been rebuilt and rethought, are very dense and very walkable. And then, of course, there's the other ones of imagining the future. Again, this one of King's Cross Master Plan by Foster's Associates, of taking up all the old railway land where the railway tracks are and building over it and creating a new development. And so they're the new ways of thinking. And when we look back to the past, there's that whole idea of what the Greeks call the palimpsest, of writing over one layer over another, and so you change. And one of my favourite examples is just here. This is called Piazza Navona in Rome, and you can see it here in Nolly's plan. I'll talk about it in a moment, and here's a photo of it. It's that shape because originally it was a chariot course, where the chariots went round and round the course, and that's got captured. I'm talking too loud? Talk louder. Oh, sorry, I need to be closer? Sorry. Have you been hearing me? I'm sorry about that. I thought I was very loud. It's loud up here. Maybe it's not loud out there. Is that better? Okay. Sorry about that. So that idea that what was starting off as a chariot course defined the shape of the space, and the future development surrounded that, and then housing and churches got put around that, and suddenly that became the space. So by overlaying one layer of history over the next, it starts to form your city. Another thing that is shown in this plan, and that's the same space down there, the Piazza Navona, that's the Pantheon, those of you who know Rome, and there it is there, was this plan by Giovanni Battista Nolli, because Nolli drew a plan of Rome, but it's a very famous plan because he drew what we're talking about here. He drew the public spaces, but he defined the public spaces as those spaces that people could visit. So if it was a church and you went inside the church, sorry, I'm going to go back, then that was a public space. If it was a street, that was a public space. If it was a town square, then that was a public space. So anything that the public could access became a public space. So it wasn't just about the outside spaces, it was about the spaces that people used. And that's a very nice way about thinking about the public nature or the publicness of public space. In Sydney, our own city, where I come from, we had the same idea. This building is our GPO, is a post office, which was designed in the 1880s. And originally it had on the right-hand side, just here, it just had a 6-metre wide laneway. But the building was so grand and so important that they demolished buildings and widened that laneway. And then, of course, that became, there's that building on the right of these sides. That became a street. And then over time, we closed the streets off and it became a plaza. So you can see how, over time, the different uses have allowed the space to adapt, and it's now a fully pedestrian space. And there is the grand building sitting on what's now a far more pedestrian-friendly space, and the cars have all been removed and transferred to other streets. So the projects I'm going to talk about are all in Sydney. That's my hometown, and it's where I've done my work. And they're all mostly in the central business district. Now, for those of you, I suspect some of you do know Sydney, but those who don't know Sydney, Sydney's a wonderful harbour-side city. This is the harbour. The central business district, the CBD as we call it, is this precinct here. There's a ridge that runs along the middle, and most of the tall buildings are along there. There's a railway station, our major central railway station at one end. There's Circular Quay, where all the ferries come in, at the other end, and that's bounded by the Opera House that you probably all know, and the Sydney Harbour Bridge that you probably all know, especially if you watch the fireworks on New Year's Eve. And the projects I'm going to talk about are around here. That's number 1, 2, 3, and so on. And the number 3 is a bit off the page. It got a very small image if I included that, and you'll see that. And they illustrate different points. So the first one, and I've called these all design ideas, and I've given them all a title, and I've got to be honest, sometimes these titles are a little bit cute. I'm just trying to think of a way of describing it. But I'm talking about this is adjusting the fabric. The simple idea is, what can you do to capture back the space for the public? The area I'm looking at is this here area here, this street along there, and that's in front of that big central railway station I mentioned before, at the southern end of the CBD and opposite a park. Now, the reason I'm interested is I used to work in this building here. I used to look out on that. And what I was interested in is when you look from here across to here, there are 11 lanes of traffic. And you can see our traffic isn't as bad as your traffic, although this is on a fairly light day. But you don't need 11 lanes to move the number of cars that move across there. And what in fact there was is just here is the long distance coaches used to park there, pick up their passengers and go away. So that took up one lane. And then so that this coach, which is the red one, wants to overtake the white one, it needs another lane. And then there was a series of waiting sheds for the coach that sat there, and then another overtaking lane for a coach that sat there. So all up there's 5 lanes of traffic, about 20 metres. And of course I could look out on this. I watched regularly. In any point in time, although there was 11 places for buses to park, there was never more than 4 buses. So we had 20 metres by the whole length of the street taken up for 4 buses that came and went regularly. Is that okay? The simple idea I thought was, well, move the 4 buses and you get all that back. So that can all become pedestrian. So all out there can be pedestrian, all along there can be pedestrian, and we can narrow our intersections and give more space back to people. That's what it looks like now. You can see in this instance, remember I said the maximum 4 buses, there's actually 3. There's 1, 2, 3 buses there. And we can simply change it to that. The question you asked was, what do we do with the buses? Well, my idea was that you take the buses from there and put them around here. This was already undercover car parking here, and by just extending it in that direction, there's an exit road there, we could bring the buses in from this street, park them under there, and bring them back. But the point of the project was manifold. One was to make the place more public. 2 was to give this very grand building a far better and more grand setting so that it respected it as a building rather than just have a highway run past the front of it. Thirdly, it was to create a place for people to recreate, because this is that plaza, newly created plaza, is facing north, and then all the shops that are along the back there that were selling tickets for buses could become cafes and so forth. This is, if we go around the corner, that was where I was saying the buses could come in through the archways around the corner, simply come off the side street, park underground here, have escalators back up to the railway station, and still serve the same function, only a few hundred metres from where they were originally. But the point of the project was to give spaces back to the people. That's the arches, one of those arches the buses go through, and that's the underground space that the buses could park in. So it's just simply relocating. But the idea being to give the space back to people So it became a people-friendly space rather than a place where there's just buses which are belching fumes the whole time. The second project I'm talking about is seeding the idea. By seeding the idea, I'm talking about putting an idea in the public realm that then takes on its own life. I should say about that last project, it was an idea that was put before the Premier but never went ahead. So some ideas find fertile ground, some don't. This one is, our office was asked to work on St Mary's Cathedral. St Mary's Cathedral is the mother church of the Catholic Church in Australia and the largest cathedral in Sydney. I'm going a long way. But we were asked, of course, it was falling to repair, it needed some repairs. Gee, it's very sensitive, this, I'm sorry. Going back. Within the brief that we were asked to look at, we were asked to look at putting the spires back on the building. It didn't have spires at the time. That was originally designed with spires. We were asked to look at putting a new organ in there. We were asked to look at changing the liturgy, but we're also asked to look at the urban setting. Now you can see from this photo that the cathedral is surrounded by roads. It sort of sits on an island, and they're pretty harsh roads, and particularly over on the southern side, you can see there's roads in all directions here. So to get from there, you have to hop from island to island to island to finally get to the cathedral, which is not a particularly great setting for the cathedral. So one of the things we talked about, we said, well, if we just reconfigured that road, I'll get this right soon, if we just reconfigured that road on the right-hand side of your slide, we could create a small plaza at the front there. So we've still got the road there, but instead of having bypasses and so on, just reduce it to 2 lanes each way, make it more of a right-angle intersection, and we can create a small plaza in front of the cathedral. We can do the same at the northern end, and that will help. Or, of course, we could take the long-term vision where you take the road out. You don't have the road anymore, you return the road back to park, and then you can get a fairly substantial square out the front of the cathedral. So that's what the cathedral looks like at the moment, and you can see the roads going past it. That little plant is sitting on a traffic island in the middle, so it's fairly isolated. Our idea was to put the new spires in the front and have a new plaza out the front of it. Now the trouble with this idea is our client was the cathedral, but the road was owned by the city, and the land opposite the road was owned by the city. So the cathedral couldn't do much about it without the city coming on board. We also looked at other ideas for the spires because we were changing the liturgy and moving the predella and the Eucharist down to the crossing. We thought another idea might be to put a glass spire on top of the cathedral and flood that crossing with light. That was too radical an idea for the Archbishop, so that one didn't go ahead. But you can certainly see here the new plaza that we're proposing out the front. And there it is with the spires that were originally designed, which are the ones we did finally install. So what happened next? Well, what happened next is the City of Sydney were looking for ideas with a new mayor of how they could do civic improvements. So we put this idea before them, and they got their own team to look at it, and they borrowed our idea. They said, could we? I said, well, yes, of course you could. And they came up with the idea of putting a new plaza out the front. You can see it there, that little plaza. And then in the park here, they wanted to put a new swimming pool and an aquatic centre. So what they eventually did is put the aquatic centre below the plaza. So underneath that fountain is a swimming pool, and there's a new plaza. You can see while the plaza is being built, so with the spires being put up. These were trying to be finished in time for the 2000 Olympics in Sydney when we had that, and that generated a lot of activity. And you can see there, that's the final photo with the new plaza at the front, with the new spires put on place. And the point of the talk is that although we didn't design the plaza, by seeding the idea, the plaza eventually came about. So a brand new public space happened in Sydney through working with the cathedral, even though the land was owned by the city. The next idea is a project that came out of the environmental constraints of the site that drove the environmental design. And these are all not about architects, these are all about the civic design. I have to keep reinforcing. The site was an industrial site, an old industrial site in the south of Sydney, that arrow that was at the bottom of the map that I showed you. That was what the site looked like after they demolished the factories. But when we started to do some investigation, we found that the site that's circled there was actually built. I have to speak closer to the microphone again. I'm sorry. For all of those who couldn't hear, I apologise. Should I start all over again? I won't do that. Up here it sounds very loud, but everyone can hear okay? Yeah, okay. I do apologise. So this project was, as I was saying, was driven by environmental ideas, because when we looked at the site, we found it was built on old marshlands. That means it was used to get flooded near the bay, and Botany Bay, which is the bay just south of Sydney, is quite nearby. And so that meant that the water table, the level of the water below the soil, was quite close, and it was a problem. So after heavy rains, this area flooded. So the idea was, when we inherited this master plan, this was the master plan that had been done for the redevelopment of this site, our idea was to rethink that and say, well, the master plan's the one on the left. If we ran all the streets to the right, instead of having a park in the middle and put our park over on the left-hand side there, which is in the west, we could collect all the water there and manage it better. Now, they were very attracted by this idea, but they're also very wedded to that curved road in the middle. So, of course, there was a compromise, and the compromise was this layout, which was, again, generated by the shape of the road that had already been committed to, but using the cross streets to collect water. Now, by collecting water, what I mean is this, is that when it rains, we're taking the water on the roads, collecting it, running it through channels so that it got filtered through reed beds. So firstly there was the movement of the water, then there was a filtration. It got held in detention parks when it overflooded, so the parks themselves took the flooding rather than the houses. And then we took it to recycling ponds and recycled the water so we could reuse it. To illustrate how that works, instead of the roads, most roads camber from the centre out to the edge, and you have gutters on the edge. We cambered the road to the centre and collected the water in the middle. And you can see that the curbs that are along the middle there are staged, they're perforate, so it allows the water to run through. When the water runs through, it's collected in these channels, and all those plants that are in there help to clean the water. They filter the water. That's the primary treatment for cleaning the water. They then get carried underground, so there you can see the street with the new planting. This is a few years old. These trees are very tall now. So that's the idea for the street. And then they get taken to the ponds, and in the ponds there's more reeds that treat the water. And the water treatment is so successful that we were able to repipe the water back to water the parks and even allow kids to play in it. So we're taking the water that was fairly not good, road runoff water, polished it enough so that we could reuse it. We couldn't drink it, but we could certainly reuse it to play in, and certainly for watering purposes. Now, the whole point about this is that the whole design idea here came from the environmental constraints of the site. By recognising the water table issues, we used that to lay out the roads, to lay out the parks, to lay out where the ponds were, and so that became the generator of the design thinking. So that's why I called it environmentally led design. This example is swapping around the usual paradigm. I'm sorry, I don't know how it works in the Philippines, but in Australia, most of the planning controls are written and legislated in planning control documents called local environment plans or development control plans, and they tend to set the limits on how things work. So the height of the building, how much density there can be, how much floor space, they're regulated. And so what happens is then the architects come along and try and work within those regulations to find things for building. The other constraint on that is the land ownership pattern. What the parcel of land is determines what the shape of the building will be. So you put those three things together, and that's how you get your city growing up. Well, there was a particular site in Sydney, down near the north end of Sydney, that had a very mixed ownership, land ownership pattern. You can see on the left-hand slide there, all those little lines are the different land ownerships, and they made it very confusing. It also had a couple of laneways, the ones running from left to right, or east to west as it is. Those laneways existed, but the other ones shown in orange didn't. So our idea was, if you took the same amount of floor space, but redistributed it on that, with a different built form, could you get a better urban outcome, and could you get a better built form? So that would have meant that the landowners had to agree with each other about how they swapped the land around in agreement with the city. So the first thing we did was we did three different models. The second one, this one here, said, well, if we join all the laneways up, maybe we can create a public space in the middle. The other one is if we could carry the laneway through the north, the public space that already exists to the north, we could maybe increase its size. And the third one is, well, maybe if we drive the street that's in the west of the site through the street, we could create a new boulevard and a new address. So the one that was chosen was the second one. The city thought that one had the most merit. And you can see the diagrams down below are how the floor space would be redistributed in each of those models. So it's the same amount of floor space, but it's redistributing in different ways. The other constraint on the site was making sure that any buildings we put there didn't cast shadows on public spaces further south. In Australia, the sun moves across our north, so the shadows flow to the south. It's the reverse of here. So having chosen this model, we then did the usual analyses to look at where you wanted your active street frontages, where your level changes were, all those sort of issues, and there was a lot of work done to do that. But what it fundamentally meant is that the parcels of land now were different to the land ownership pattern. But there was about 2 or 3 major landowners who were very keen on this idea because they could see that by having the extra height, they could get greater value out of the site because there were very good views from this site. So the existing development controls, the existing building is the one dotted there, and the new tall towers are taking that building and, if you like, stacking half of it on top of the other. So you're narrowing the building but making it taller. So you're letting the light through to the public space and you're giving greater height, same amount of floor space. That was a development plan that was lodged on the site under the former controls. And so you can see it's a squat and flat building. What was allowed was a taller building in that place. The developers were so happy with this idea, they ran an international design competition. That was won by a firm called Kerry Hill, they're Singapore-based architects, and that's their winning design, and that's a picture of it there. And they even made the tower smaller. They made it the same height, but they made it a little bit tighter because they were designing luxury apartments and they could get the yield they needed that way. So the end result was that we had different sorts of buildings. We think we got a much better building outcome. We got more light into our public space, and we actually created a public space. So instead of letting the controls dictate the design of the buildings, we said that the buildings could dictate the controls. It was the other way around, and it's moving ahead. There's already been a development application approved for this very project. So that's where we're just flipping around planning-led design to design-led planning, which I think for us architects is a much better way to go. The next one I'm calling setting the agenda. It's really looking at a project that didn't have an urban design initiative and putting one there. The area we're looking at is this is an area called Walsh Bay. You can see the Sydney Opera House in the background, which is the next bay round. And in fact, the building I was just talking about, these are all very close to each other, is that one just there. That's the site that's being redeveloped in that last project. So in this, these wharves were primarily shipping wharves back in right up till the 1950s. Ships used to pull in here and deliver their goods and take the shipping. The shipping and containers have all moved out of Sydney Harbour to Botany Bay, south of Sydney now. And so these wharves were available for redevelopment. They're all timber wharves. They're massive structures, and they're quite unique in the world. What the government did is they sold off parts of that. So some of these got turned into residential developments, and the shore sheds along there got turned into residential. Some got turned into commercial development, and these two were left to become, and that one's a hotel over there. These two were left to become for for cultural uses. Now already since the 1980s, moved into there was one of Sydney's famous theatres, the Sydney Theatre Company. They had a theatre in there, and an Aboriginal dance group, the Bangarra Dance Company, they were in there as well. But the next wharf had remained empty for a long while. So there are the wharves, a view looking down from the top. We'd already put solar panels on the roofs for the theatre that was there. And that's looking down an aerial view of the site we're looking at. If we go in detail into that, that's how it looks at the moment. Sorry, that's how it looks at the moment. And the problem we had is that the two wharves, which are the two we're looking at, is this one and this one. This one already has has uses in it, this one doesn't have uses in it. The trouble is they're very long wharfs, so to walk to the end from one to the other and then back to the end of the other one, it's probably about a kilometre. So, you know, this is too far. So what can we do about that? The other thing is, because the old wharves had a wall of buildings along the side there, that you could walk along this street and not know that there was anything beyond. So there was no understanding that there was a place. So the idea was we need to create a place. So I'm going the wrong way. Sorry. That's right. So the same diagram, by filling that in, by putting a deck in here, we create a major new public space in this space. And by putting a bridge here, it means you can walk from one wharf to the other without having to go all the way back and back round again. So that was the basic concept. The other one is there's a new park being built in Sydney here, and there's there's already an existing park here, which I'll be talking about in a minute. So the idea is then to make the street that links them a green street. At the moment that's full of car parking, and the idea is to put the car parking below the ground and have a park along the street, because it's quite a wide street. So trying to create a new space. So that's it in detail. You can sort of see that. And the idea of the space, the wharfs are quite high. They're about 2 metres above the sea level. So the other idea was to have that major new plaza step down to the water, so you could actually engage with the water and you could have activities to do that. We then did a diagram of where you would put your development, where you put your vertical circulation, what areas were available for commercial activities, what areas were available for the theatres. They did a tender for the people who would be the theatre companies that came on board. There was another 6 companies coming to this area, so it became an arts precinct. And so we did some stacking diagrams of where they could go, what they would do, did some preliminary layouts of how they would work and where the theatres would fit within the volume of the building, to see how that would work. And then the whole idea was to create a new place. So this needed activity and fun. It needed to have a curated program of arts activities, but this will become a new, vibrant, we hope, vibrant centre for Sydney, based around performing arts. So it's a whole performing arts precinct with even performances out on this major space here. We even imagined that you could have a floating stage in the middle and the whole wharves would start to act like an amphitheatre, so it became a new space for things. So that was the idea. This is the park I talked about along the street behind, so that the what was car parking became a place for people, and then of course cafes and restaurants can fill in the buildings on either side that are currently empty and don't have uses, because it's a fairly degraded area at the moment and we're trying to move it forward. So the whole idea here was to try and create a new place, to take an old bit of infrastructure and give it a new life. But because it didn't, I think there's an expression, when you get there, there's no there. We wanted to make something there, and the new there was a new public place. So the public place was the focus of the generator for new activity. And the last one I want to talk about is probably our most famous place in Sydney. It's Circular Quay. It's probably been designed and redesigned throughout its life. It was and so this is the one I'm talking about, looking to the future, because that last project I just spoke about, it's been put before government and it's just received funding. So we're very confident that's going to go ahead in the next few years. This one was an idea about looking 50 yees ahead. So that's a long way out. What would you do if you didn't have the limitations of what would government do now, but what are we going to do in the future? So it was just a design exercise. And within that, there's a range of projects, some of which you could do tomorrow, some of which would take a very long time to achieve, and you'll see why. So Circular Quay, that's this part of Sydney that's bounded, as I said before, on either side by the Harbour Bridge on one side and the Opera House on the other. The area we're looking at is this area in here. That's the area we were just looking at, and that's the building I was talking about that's been redeveloped in the other one. And the railway's just down there. The other side, whoa, it's very sensitive. The other site we looked at, the industrial site, with the Environmental Design Initiative, is right down back there, and St Mary's Cathedral is just there. So they're all within that spectrum. This is a drawing that was done by a couple of colleagues of mine. They run a design studio where they got their students to draw all the public buildings in Sydney, And this is, I guess, what we call our own Nolly plan, because they drew the insides of all the public buildings as well as all the public spaces. And again, it's this area here we're looking at. So this area, as I said, Circular Quay, it's been thought and rethought hundreds of times. Where the current harbour bridge, gee, so sensitive. Where the current harbour, won't let me do it. Where the current harbour bridge is, that was an early design for Harbour Bridge. That's where the Opera House now sits. But right back here in the 1920s, they were proposing a railway across the front, across here. And that did, in fact, happen eventually. In 1988, we had a bicentennial. This was the cove that the first fleet, the fleet of the first convicts that came to Australia, so the first European settlement. This is the cove they landed, so it's the founding place of European settlement in Australia. It's a place where many immigrants who have come to Australia arrive, because there's a big overseas passenger terminal where the big ship is. And it's a major commuter terminal, because all the ferries from all around the harbour come into this point to deliver people to the city. And of course, running across the south is the railway. In 1988, because we were having a bicentennial celebrations about the first landing at this place, there was a major upgrade in this area, and this drawing represents that upgrade, where lots of civic works were done. As part of that upgrade, they upgraded the wharves, and that was them, and they were pretty sad. By the time the Olympics came round in 2000, everything was looking a bit tired, so there was another regeneration, and our office did the upgrade of the wharves again to try and make them more open, and so you could get better views out and get better breezes through. We also upgraded the railway station, so where there used to be a solid wall and you couldn't enjoy the views, we turned it into a glass balustrade so you could look out, took away all the signage, put seats there so that people could, when they caught the train into the station, could enjoy the view out while they're waiting for their trains. And so now looking at this area, we'll work around it bit by bit, and I hope it'll become self-evident as we work. So that's where we are at the moment. This is the vision for the future, and I'll take you through it step by step. If we start at the top, which is the north, in this little precinct up there, it's called Dawes Point. And the simple idea with Dawes Point was that at the moment there's a road. Gee, I wish I should have brought a mouse, shouldn't I? Around here, there's a road. If I go back to the slide before, you can see it. There's a road that goes right round here under the bridge and connects to that road around there. Our idea was that in the long term, if you tunnelled beneath the harbour bridge here, it's built on solid rock, just there, it's only about 80 metres across there. You could take the road from the south and join the road from the north, and then all that top part can become park. So by removing the road and just making a shortcut through by building a tunnel, you can then return that whole headland back to park. So you can bring the grass and the headland right back down to the harbour edge the way it was originally. So originally there was, the natural landform went down to the harbour. We've cut that off with the road. By removing the road, we can re-establish that. So we can create a new public park, which is currently mostly road infrastructure. You can see how I have a thing against roads. Further back with the little bay that was in there, that's currently got a wharf in the middle of it. We're removing the wharf in the middle. We're extending this pier along here so that we can deal with bigger ships, because the cruise ships that come into Sydney are getting bigger and bigger, and so we need to increase the berthing. But at the same time, we can bring ferries and stop them up here, and you'll see why we're doing that a little bit later. So we create a new place and create a new plaza at the southern end of this bay, so again, so you can step down and get in touch with the water so kids can play in the water and so forth. As we move further south from that, we come to the overseas passenger terminal where the big ships come in. As I said, the ships are getting bigger, so we want to increase that pier out to the north and create the bay. But our other idea was, instead of having a passenger terminal, it's a building, we have a passenger terminal that's a park. So we have a building but put a park over the top of it so that the public space can enjoy that. So our whole idea is to try and create more public spaces. And that idea you can see there, where the passenger terminal is below. You have a simple arrivals hall up at the ship level, and then people go down by lifts, and all the provideering and all the other things you need to do to service ship are done at the lower level, and a park rises up above that. So you've got a new park that exists there. The little plaza with the big tree in it is already existing, so it would just be joining into that. Then behind that passenger terminal, behind that park, we'd open up what's currently a road, and at weekends and certain times of the year that could become markets and get far more activated and animated, because it's only when the ships are in that you need to bring vehicles along that road. Then as we moved further south, we want to create more parks, so put more grass and parklands in there and extend the plaza so that you've got a major boulevard along the foreshore, but backed up by parks, which open up the views for the city back to the water. At the same time this was happening, the big building that fronts those parks was being redeveloped, and a new extension, this new extension was being built. And so we thought that it wanted a new plaza out the front of it, so we could incorporate that new plaza with a new park next to it. So that was an early design idea. That was, again, as the design was being developed. And then this is it now. That building has been finished and is complete. And as you can see, there's a new plaza out the front. And as you move south, there's the big new grasslands. So the first of our design ideas actually has come about, but there's many more we're still waiting for. So that's that view from above that you're looking at. As you can see here, I'm frightened of pressing too hard. That's the new building that just got added on to the old building. That was the old Museum of Contemporary Art, and that's the new extension wing to it. And this is the new park where there's a small park there, but we're hoping to expand and create in this instance. And again, because the land slopes from here back up that way, create an amphitheatre which focuses out towards the harbour and towards the Opera House, and that will be the view you see across that park. The last area is the southern area where the blue line is running through. And what the blue line is showing is where currently there's a major piece of infrastructure. It's a railway and a roadway on a deck that go past. And a lot of debate in Sydney over many years. Remember that slide I showed you from the 1920s when they proposed a railway across Circular Quay? Well, when they finally built it in the 1950s, they did exactly that. They built it across Circular Quay. It comes from one part of the city over here and moves across and then goes underground. So it comes from underground, goes above ground across Circular Quay and goes underground again. If you were to remove that railway, and there's a big if there and there's a lot of things to talk about, but if you remove that railway, a few things happen. All these blocks of land become available for development. Now these blocks of land are very, very valuable because they're right facing the harbour. They've got some of the best views in Australia, so they're very valuable pieces of land. But if you remove the railway, what would you do with it? So that was our challenge. The other thing that was lacking in this part of the world is a major public space. There is a very famous old building here called Customs House, and it has a little square in front of it. And our idea was, well, if we could push the square through to there, then we could make the square a waterfront square rather than just a square behind the piece of infrastructure. To do that, we had to remove a wharf. There were 5 wharfs across there, and we want to get it back to 4 wharfs. So our idea was that all the commuter ferries that come from all the stops around the harbour come here should stay here, but those that are for commercial uses, those that run cruises and things like that, we move them around, as I said before, to here and to here, so that they get moved away so we can create a new public place around here. So that was the idea. The other idea with the railway, I'll explain as we go. So that's a blow up of that area, and these are existing sites that could be revealed, and these are new sites that we would then occupy, and I'll explain how. So that's the infrastructure at the moment. As you can see, there's a railway deck based on major concrete piers at the base, and above it there's a road deck. You can also see that the city is pretty much cut off from the harbour by this major piece of infrastructure. The trouble is, the road deck and the rail deck are run by different organisations. I guess that's the same here. The State Rail runs the rail, and the Roads and Transit Authority run the roads. So different people own different stratas of this. So it's a very hard thing to touch. But as I said, this was a vision for 50 years in the future. What would you do? So 2 ideas are, one, maybe just remove the road deck. We've got plenty of roads in Sydney. We've just built a new tunnel across the harbour to take roads. Do we need to have those few lanes that are taking things off the harbour bridge and bringing them to the east? Maybe there's other ways we could do that. and just leave the station. So that's the top diagram where the station stays, but we just move the station box away and allow the plaza to come through. The bottom diagram is more radical. That's saying, let's take the station out as well, the railway track, put it underground and move it south. Now the reason to move it south is so that we can get our plazas facing the water, but also because to build it you'd have to keep the one that's existing on the northern alignment, you have to keep that there while you put the underground one here, and so you couldn't pull one down to build the other. So there's a staging thinking about that as well. So these are the two ideas. One idea was that you let the plaza come through under the railway, but you keep the railway, but you demolish the roadway at the top, so there's a roadway gone. The other idea is, that's where the current railway is you put it underground and then clear all this space. And then the space that was clear behind it, which was road, you turn that into public plaza and you put your development on this side so that you contain that public plaza with buildings the same height as the old heritage building that's on there as well. So there's the old heritage building at the back. You can see there. There's the new plaza. There's our newly configured wharves, and this is now available to be sold for development, but we believe that should be kept low scale because all the towers can go behind it. And so, hence the new plaza. So that might be a different look for Sydney. Now, the question you've got to ask is, well, how can we do this? Well, you can't do it easily. You have to remove a road, never easy. You have to remove a railway, very, very difficult. And the only way that can happen is when they're building new railways. There are proposals to build a new cross-city link. The trains go across the harbour bridge at the moment. There's a proposals to soon, in the next few years, build another tunnel to increase the capacity for rail under the harbour. When that happens, it's the time you could then, because the gradient of the trains is down lower, you could then sink the trains down below the platform. Very expensive exercise. I'm not sure the government's got an appetite for it, but what we're trying to do is put some forward thinking there so that as opportunities come up, maybe there's new ways of thinking about the future. So yeah, when you put it all together, that's the first slide I showed you, and that's what it would all look like. We called it Grinning Circular Quay because we're putting a lot more parks back. I forgot to mention that where we took the railway down, we thought we should put an avenue of trees in there, so you've got shady places to create a different sense of space, so you've got shade and places for people to sit and relax and enjoy the harbour, because it's one of our great assets. Now this is just a little video, and I'll talk as it goes. There we go. And this is just showing you all the things I've showed you, but it might have been confusing. This puts it all in one picture. So you can see the different components, the overseas passenger terminal, the Circular Quay West Parks, the removal of the expressway, and the creation of the new plaza, all based on these sort of ideas that we integrate the transport, that we engage the public realm with the waterfront, that we make the Circular Quay greener, and that we try and get the city connecting better to the harbour through the new public spaces. And in that process, activating the waterfront and developing new opportunities for development as well. So with luck we should fly in here. Yes, the ferry's moving, so we're moving. So at Dawes Point, the first point, as I said, was to remove the road. Now this project could happen tomorrow. It's a very easy project. It's building a very short tunnel and just redirecting the road. So, and creating a new public park. So that's not a hard one to do. Extending the new wharfs, that's going to have to happen soon because the size of the passenger terminals, passenger ships that are coming into Sydney are getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and so we need to increase the size of the terminal to deal with it. Creating a new space behind the new passenger terminal, which will get more sun into it, can be more activated by public uses. This is the good one to talk about because this is after we did this presentation. It had already happened, so we haven't done this passenger terminal yet, but the plaza out the front of the MCA, that's the Museum of Contemporary Art, that's happening. The new park we'd like to propose with that new avenue of trees to the south, and of course the big move is removing the railway, and these things never come lightly. I guess the point of all the projects I've been showing you is the whole idea of trying to create public spaces, making spaces, new spaces for people to use. And that sometimes means getting rid of cars, relocating railways. I'm a very strong advocate of railways, but they've got to work with the public spaces. So that's it. So this I hope that little fly through gave you an idea of how that whole package fits together. So as I said, there's a big vision, but lots of little packages within it, and we think some of them will come to fruition sooner than others. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Architect Mould.